competitive. If you want to create new jobs, that means we need to focus on the issue of industrialization. I think Africa has very much understood that. And so the notion of being an emerging economies, focusing on economic transformation, focusing on industrialization processes, not the old-fashioned way of organized economy and strongly managed economy, but having initiatives that are trying to move to industrialization services in such a way that it creates jobs is a prerequisite for the sustainability and for viability of African economies. I think in Europe and in the case of donors, there's sometimes too much a focus on the traditional aspects. And if we think about trade, there's too much focus on simply very important dimension, trade facilitation and how do you help the trade and so on, but not enough on the production side, not enough on how do you on the importance of local contents, on the importance of proactive policies. And there's still, for many in Europe, the notion of industrialization is a bit of a frightening word. So it's not something that donors would immediately support. They would support growth through liberalization, through trade, but they will not support the notion of industrialization. At the end of the day, you will not have a sustainable growth if you don't create more jobs for young people. So I think donors should be less frightened about these kind of strategic approaches and should embrace it more forcefully, and sometimes focusing really much more on what are the opportunities for young people, creating better jobs, and see trade as a tool to promote that and include, not to serve simply the local market, but to serve the regional and international markets. That can work, but also not forget the non-tradable sector of the economy, which is very important, or the more localized trade. My advice is, let's move beyond the ideology that trade is bad or trade liberalization will be fantastic and will provide all the prosperity. It's the path that is very important. So of course it is important for poor countries to be able to export their products without restrictions or easily to the international market. So I think in that direction there is a recognition that this is important. Now the way they open up their own markets, this is to be liberalization has to be perceived as part of a regulatory reform of the country. And I think that's one of the problems also with these trade agreements that have been negotiated. So it's one of the notion is that if you enter into trade negotiation with a developing country, and particularly in Africa, you are going to lock in some of their reforms or to induce them to conduct some of the reforms they would otherwise not do. I think the argument only is valid to some extent, and there are serious limits. A country that does not want to reform in general, with a trade agreement, is unlikely to do the reform. And in fact, what is more likely to happen is that it might have some damaging effects on the population. 2030 agenda seems to be rediscovering the role of private sector, but I think it's simply the development community that is accepting that private sector has an important role to play, much more than it was emphasized in the context of the MDGs. But if you talk to private sector and if you talk to actors on the ground or any developing country, they have known for a long time that private sector is the condition. Without private sector, you don't create wealth, you don't create prosperity. So the role of the private sector is not something that is new. Now, the notion that any kind of interaction with the private sector or any kind of activities of the private sector is good for development is foolish as well. I mean, we know that there are very damaging type of practices that are done by the private sector, and so it needs to be regulated. So the question is indeed how to promote and how to combine. So the worst we can have is what I heard in the past from some of the actors, is say the development cooperation actors saying we want to push development and we don't want to know what what our ambassador and what our diplomats are doing to push our economic interests, because they don't deal with development cooperation, and we don't want to mix the two. Not knowing what your right hand is doing when you're the left hand is not necessarily a sign of coherence. What is, of course, the danger is that the economic dimension, to keep this analogy of the right and left hand, is as it's capturing the left hand. So that development cooperation becomes, since there's a lot of money, becomes just another way of financing private sector support and supporting the interests of the private sector. And so there should be a stronger reflection on how these public support instruments, export credit agencies, or matchmaking framework, European Enterprise Network, for instance, at the European level, that is supposed to help companies to meet. How can these instruments, even when they're not part of the development cooperation, can include this notion of sustainability in a more forceful way? Because then you would be able to use non-development cooperation instruments to support the private sector in a sustainable manner that then also contribute to development. And then you really create the synergy between what your right and your left hand is doing, and not an artificial dichotomy.